Hi, everybody, and welcome to the world of Thomas Kincade.
I have about 20 of his paintings.
80 paintings.
Approximately 175 of his paintings.
Yeah, way too many. Art is something for everyone.
By 2000, the company was breaking 100 million. For what was being sold, that was unheard of.
250, 10,000, 250, 10,500.
People were buying not just a painting, they were buying a piece of Thomas Kincade, which involved a performance as a pious Christian.
God bless.
I mean, he was like a holy man.
I'm not going to fall victim to the same crises that you see in so many people who get put in the public eye. That won't happen to me.
People who described him as a Jekyll and Hyde Christian painter of light by day and raging strip club attending, out of control, drunk by night.
He had it all, and he threw it away.
We knew that the vault existed, but I don't remember ever going in there.
Uh-oh.
I'm glad that he made these. Wow.
You could say Thomas Kincade was a performance artist, and he created the greatest performance art piece in our lifetime.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Carolyn Talks. This is the podcast / YouTube channel where I, your host Carolyn Hines, film culture critic and journalist, speak to film creatives around the world about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I am very happy to be joined by filmmaker Miranda Yousef to talk about her documentary, Art for Everybody, about one of the most prolific painters, I would say, in modern history, Thomas Kincade, and it delves into both the light, pun fully intended, and dark side of his work and his life. And for me, I knew of the name Thomas Kincade, but when I got the email and I watched the trailer, I'm like, wait, I know this artwork. You know, I'm like, I've seen this artwork. I've touched this artwork. And because I'm from Barbados, but like, yeah, I realized as I was watching the film, I was like, wait a minute, I think the painting in my living room in my family home back home in Barbados is a Thomas Kincade painting. Because he has a very distinctive art style. So I was like, that made me even more excited to talk to you, because I was like, oh, look at me here talking about the artwork of a painter who I just might have in my living room. And I even tried video calling my mom to ask her to look for the name, but she wasn't answering. And I'm like, of course, the one time I'm calling her on WhatsApp and she's not answering is the one time I need confirmation of this. But thank you so much for joining me, Miranda. This is very pleasurable for me. Yay.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn. And yeah, you know, it's interesting because when I was growing up, Thomas Kincade was everywhere. Mm-hmm. He was in the ether, he was just all over the place. And there's, a younger generation that doesn't know who he was, which is sort of shocking to me. But but then they'll look at his paintings and they'll be like, this looks familiar. You know, that happens with that experience that you had happens a lot. And I think in a way it's because his work has become sort of this archetype of what that style of painting is supposed to look like. And, before he came on the scene, there were people who were painting collectible plates and pictures of cottages and snowmen and, all of that. But the fact is they were not nearly as skilled of a painter as Thomas Kincade was. He was extraordinarily skilled.
Back home in Barbados, I was born in 1983. So I was born right at the time a lot of projects and products became very commercialized through TV promotions. And, like everything was being sold through like QVC. We didn't have QVC, but we would get it sometimes if we on cable or what we call satellite dish TV. And we see the commercials, like for the collectible plates, the mugs, for things like the little carved snowmen, the figurines, very much Americana style art. And then of course, we started to see things like VHS tapes, like the when DVDs started to become really popular, you'd have films be advertised. And then of course there was the music. Music on CDs was very popular to be seen and sold on late night television. So the film really does kind of touch on commercialism of art and how like that kind of coalesced very, I think almost like his work and the mass production of art kind of happened at the exact same time. And I think he was kind of like maybe an innovator in that sense that people don't even realize how very much his business model sparked commercialization of art in mass media, in like different medias, because like, you have the mugs, you have the plates, you have the sofas like covered in chairs, the bags. I was thinking about it, my aunt Jeanette has a bag that has a Thomas Kincade picture on it, because like you know that it's his because he has a very distinctive art style. And like those things were so literally everywhere, because even though they were sold mainly in America, they would have eventually reached a broader market through like reselling, you know, through like people buying something at like a thrift store, you know, at like a garage sale. So like they permeated like culture like globally. And so for you, I want to talk to you first as a filmmaker, because like you started in editing, and like your work as an editor is very much like the thing with art. And I want to compare your work as an editor to his work as an artist, because the thing with editing is you have to know exactly when to time the switch of a story, how everything fits together as a story. You know, you have to create the perfect story through your editing. And his art is very much about perfection, about creating this idyllic lifestyle, creating this idyllic personification of what he thinks perfect Americana is. And I thought it was interesting that his work is very focused on America.
Yeah.
Even though he did a lot of his work in England. You know, he found the idea of perfection in England, in the Cotswold. So I want to talk about just like the idea of perfection and how you, as an editor, piece together your story to make the perfect story, and comparing that to his art as an artist, where he's like piecing together the perfect cottages, you know, the perfect lighting, the perfect symbolism of Americana as an artist. It sounds like a very complicated question. Forgive me for that.
Very hard question. I mean, you know, so in terms of editing, you know, in documentary film editing, it's a little bit different than fiction film editing, because in fiction, you have a script. So you already have a blueprint of how it's supposed to be put together. Whereas in documentary editing, quite often you're given a pile of footage and you have to find a way to make it have meaning. And so early in my career, I just started developing a process to try and systematize, you know, how do we tell the story? And I actually brought that process to this is my directorial debut. And so I just was like, well, this is what I know how to do. So when we were planning out our shoots in the beginning of film pre-production, I just did exactly what I do when I'm at the beginning of post-production on somebody else's film, which is I basically figured out what I wanted to say, and then I mapped out the scenes that I thought I would need in order to tell that story. Because it's actually ultimately it's a writing process. You're just writing with visuals and sound. And, you know, with Kincade, one of the things that we didn't include in the film, but it was in the interview that I did with Alexis Boylan, who is one of our experts in the film. You know, Alexis talked about in our interview, how Kincade's pictures are this kind of strange pastiche that he's putting in elements that aren't really supposed to belong together into one picture, but he does it really cleverly and with enough skill that like you don't notice it. So the example that I remember her giving was that he would call a painting, you know, Sunrise in Maryland or whatever, you know, like he would give it a location, but then he would be painting flowers that like could in no way survive in Maryland. You know, so it was like he was basically just pulling from his imagination. And the thing that he was doing, in my opinion, is, you know, he's painting what he really wanted. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the Kincade's powers of denial.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you a little story. We premiered our theatrical release at the end of March in New York City. And the screenwriter of the Christmas Cottage film, which we show in the movie, came to one of our New York screenings. And he introduced himself during the Q&A, and we all clapped for him. And and he said that, you know, as the writer of this film that was supposed to be this kind of autobiographical movie about Thomas Kincade, he and Thomas had to talk a lot. And they talked about his childhood, and they talked about his parents. And the writer was saying that he kept on saying to Tom, you know, it sounds like your father was a serious alcoholic. And Tom would invariably reply, oh no, he was just a crazy guy. So Ken Lezebnik, the screenwriter, he was saying to me that it just seemed like Kincade had really strong powers of denial. Like he was deeply in denial about his father's problems. And I think that translates into the work. You know, I think that's what he was doing with all of the Painter of Light works, is he was sort of saying, look over here. And in a way, he was denying his own, all the pain that he had in his past by just channeling this, you know, sort of almost desperate imagination into what we call the Painter of Light works.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that because in the first half of the film, you talk about his how he became the Painter of Light. You know, like going from his college work, his work as a background painter on, like he did it for one film. He worked as a background painter for animated film, and then he just started to work commercially. You know, after he married his wife and Nanette. And something that I thought interesting, and I don't know if someone has said it, but it just didn't make it in the final cut, is like his film is very much fantasy. His work is very much about, it would work in a fantasy film. It would work in a fantasy cartoon, you know, about fairies, you know, about woodland creatures. Like you can, like I think one of the guests in the documentary does say that he kind of likens the houses having such bright, intense light coming from in them to like the Hansel and Gretel story. You know, and he was the only person that kind of made that comparison. But I was thinking that the entire time I watched the film, I was like, this man has created a very much a fantasy world, and it does focus a lot on Americana and like the idealism that sits very much in the pocket of like, I remember those old, was it Eden Blyton books, like books set around the 1920s, late 1890s, like very within a very specific time frame and a very specific look. But also just thinking like he could have been like work that could fit into like almost like the Lord of the Rings, where it's very, very much fantasy, where he talks a lot about light. He calls himself the Painter of Light. But I was noticing that a lot of his paintings does have very dark elements. If you think about it, they have like these very kind of like dark, sinister overtones where like there's an element of darkness somewhere in the film, because light doesn't exist without dark. You know, and while he may have wanted people to focus on the light coming from the houses, and he named his company Lampposts and all of this stuff, you can't have light without dark. Right. You know, there has to be a darkness. So when you say like he kind of like lives in denial, I was like, that is literally it. Like he's denying the dark aspects of light. You know, and like, and I thought it was kind of sad because like to me, one of the things that makes art so amazing as a communication medium is that it allows us to talk about everything encompassed in one piece of art, you know, like, and like he refused to acknowledge that. And I think that was something that really burdened him, the fact that he didn't talk about it. If he had talked about it, he would have been, I think, would have been very much more regarded as an actual serious artist than just as a mass producer of commercial art.
Yeah, I mean, one of the moments in the film that lots of people are struck with is when towards the end we have an art expert and theologian named Daniel Seidel, who's in the film, and he says that the thing about Kincade's works is that there's no room for grace. That they are painted in a pre-lapsarian world, a world before the fall. And because redemption is such a crucial part of human experience, you know, and Kincade's paintings don't offer any hint of that, Daniel Seidel thinks that because of that, that because he was denying that the works killed him.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
Yeah, that's what you're saying is, you know, he basically, you know, my thesis going into the film was denying yourself full self-expression will destroy you.
It was, because there's a line that he says in like the in the voiceover, he says like he's a spokesman for an ideal. And I'm like, but for what kind of ideal? Because like a lot of people would compare it to like he was very much like an evangelical preacher, but he was an evangelical preacher not only of Christianity as a religious, but the religion, but also of his own work as a symbolism of religion, of a symbolism of Christianity. Because, and I think it's very easy to say, oh yeah, he's talking about an ideal of white Christianity, of white perfectionism, because someone as did notice, and I noted the same thing, even made it in my stories. I was like, where are the people of color? Where are the people of color? Like, because even in the time periods that he was painting as, people of color, Black people, like Asians, Latinos existed in America at the same time, but they're nowhere to be found.
Yeah.
And yes, and it makes you very much question, like, tell me about your morals and your ethics and your belief in inequality. And that's something that he never really talks about. So he doesn't talk about society. He talks about ideals, but he doesn't talk, okay, what is your ideal of society? Because, you know, like, what do you think about the world you actually live in?
I don't really think he was focused on that. I think, yeah, I mean, I think that my theory of Thomas Kincade, what's the term? My global theory of Thomas Kincade or whatever. My theory of Thomas Kincade is that he had these like two holes in his heart. So the first one, you know, we didn't talk about it very much in the film. We didn't go too deeply into it, but he really grew up in dire poverty. So I think the first need was for financial stability. Secondly, as we do see in the film, his father was absent, and when he was present, he was a very troubling presence. So I think the other need that Kincade had was for love. And I think you can trace both of these needs down the entirety of his life and his career and understand it. And I think that because those are the things that are motivating him, you know, he saw that cottages sell. Like, he saw that these sort of anodyne, like, non-specific images would sell. So, and they would like get him these followers, right? So, you know, at the peak of his career, he had hundreds of thousands of people who adored him, and the business was bringing in like $120 million a year, which is kind of crazy if you think about what they were selling. But like, that was the gilded cage that he built for himself, right? And this story is really kind of I think a Greek tragedy. It's an Icarus story, you know, and he couldn't. There's a moment in the film where the CEO and Kincade's wife are telling him, like, can we just stop? Let's just do a licensing business. You know, it's not going to be as profitable, but it'll be doable. And Kincade, I think because of those two driving needs that he had, like he just couldn't walk away ultimately. And so he, you know, flew too close to the sun and his wings melted.
He flew very, very close to the sun. And again, that's like the perfect analogy for someone who called himself the painter of light. And the thing that also stood out to me is because at the beginning, we kind of said like he was kind of like an tele-evangelist, but for art. And like he drew very close comparisons between his art and religion and Christianity, because like he was baptized at 20 when he was in college and all of these things. But me being a baptized Christian, I was baptized probably around 22, 23 back home in Barbados. But something that I noticed distinctly that he doesn't really talk about, and not only just in what you showed in the film, but even within his art, is that when a process of being baptized, or it should be a process of being baptized, is acknowledging where you came from. And not just economically, not just familially, but where you came from spiritually. You know, and like that's a form of acceptance. That's a form of the baptismal process. Yes, you get submerged, and they say all of your sins are washed away, and you emerge. But the thing is like we are, like in the Bible says, like man is born in sin and shaped in iniquity. And I thought that was interesting that he doesn't touch on that in his public art, but he touches on that in his private art, the art he made for himself, and not even for his family, because his family only found out about it after. But I thought it was interesting, like he's proselytizing to people, but he's not willing to talk about the dark, the sin itself. He's like, he's using his art to really talk only about the light. He's like almost showing like this imagined version of, in the Bible it talks like when you go up to heaven, like each person is gonna have their home, their mansion on a hill. You know, that's what the Bible promises, that when you reach heaven, like everyone is gonna have their own mansion on a hill. And he's kind of doing that in his art, where everyone has their idyllic setting. You know, like back in the day, we would have like these old paintings of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then like perfection is all of the living amongst the animals, the lion next to the deer, next to the sheep, all of these things. And his art kind of like symbolizes that. Like, this is your mansion on a hill, but instead of a mansion on a hill, it's a cottage in a forest. You know, because again, like the cottages are always, we're the villages. You know, there's the cityscapes, but then I noticed that a lot of his artwork, like even the painting I was thinking about in my house, is just a cottage in a field by itself.
Yeah.
Like these people aren't living, like he doesn't imagine perfection as a community, as very much isolated.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, there are some villages in the works. You know, I think that, like, you know, you can say that, I mean, was he baptized because he was trying to run away from his past? I mean, I think that's a valid question. And, you know, that means not looking at the sin or at the pain. And, you know, I mean, I think a lot of it is driven by fear, right? You just want to be in a house where their lights are on and the heat is on, and, you know, like there's somebody there for you and you're being taken care of, you know, rather than going home to this like cold, dark, empty place. You know, one of the things that you were talking about before about the fairy tale thing, you know, I was thinking about this because, you know, back when we were making the film, I was reading up about cottagecore.
Yes, that is a very big thing on Instagram.
Yeah. And I was like, I hadn't heard of it, and then like I stumbled upon it. I was like, oh yeah, Thomas Kincade and cottagecore, like he's the ultimate. But you know, somebody I think was, and I wish I remembered who it was, but they were kind of talking about cottagecore and they were talking about the fact that the United States doesn't have a long history. And so the whole, like all the fairy tales that, you know, that all comes from Europe. Like that's where we, you know, so we kind of rely on European tropes of fairy tales. And you know, you see in the film that Kincade goes to the Cotswolds and he's like having tea.
His crumpets and jam.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, could it be any clearer that, you know, he's trying to create this fantasy life for himself, you know? And the thing that really strikes me personally in that scene is that there's a moment when his wife arrives. She drives up. She's been driving on the wrong side of the road than what she's been accustomed to, so she's very rattled. And she comes out of the car and she goes and she hugs the people that they're with. And you see the way that it's shot, you see Kincade, he turns and he's looking at them. And that always strikes my heart as he's lonely. And he's like watching this, you know, moment of friendship, but he still doesn't feel like he's a part of it.
But the thing is that Because I thought about that, because there's that scene you went near Coswell. There's another scene later in the film where he's like on a golf course, because he like this scene where he has his daughter take up his hat, and he make sure to point out that it's a PGA golf tournament hat. And I'm like, clearly this was product promotion. Like, you were clearly being paid to promote this hat and the product thing. But the thing is like in the beginning, and I love the way you edited this particular shot, because it looks like, oh, it's just a like you was a way how a lot of it is filmed from like that old archival footage is that it's filmed as almost as if it's his wife recording him, like it's a family vacation, like it's a family with an old camcorder recording him and all that kind of stuff. But then but then he's telling the daughter, oh no, go back, let's do it again, pick up the hand, bring it back. And then you realize, oh wait, again, this is not a sweet family moment. This isn't his wife recording him having this amazing moment with his daughter. This is, again, promotion. This is a business moment. This is a moment of contrivance, of like a scripted. And you realize, oh wait, the person holding the camera is a film director.
Yeah.
And it's like his whole life was that. His whole life was contrivance. And the thing is that it didn't need to be, because he had the quintessential American life. He had the perfect house, the perfect wife, perfect 4 blonde-haired daughters, all the wealth, the notoriety, the art, the talent. Like, this man is incredibly talented, and he's still lonely. And I think one of the things, like for me as a person who suffers with depression, I think a lot of that comes from, because depression is very isolating. Like, there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Depression makes you feel lonely, even if you're in a crowd, even if you're with your family. And because he never confronted that depression, and because he was unwilling to confront it in his art publicly, because he never talked about it with his wife, he never talked about it with his business partners, with his daughters, with no one. He was alone, even as he was surrounded by all of these people. He was alone, even though he was a Christian, and he used Christianity, and he used religion, and he used the pulpit as a way to preach to people, to talk about perfection and talking about being the light. And it's just like, my guy, you were alone because you separated yourself from everyone, and it's just like, and it's so sad, because like you do, like the thing with a lot of artists, like art is technically an isolating thing, because you sit there with just you, your easel, your cancel, your paintbrush, and your whatever's in your head, and you put it out. But it's almost like art, almost like the art is what caused him to become even more isolated than he could have been if he had been something else.
I think that, boy, you made just like a whole bunch of really good points, and I have thoughts about all of them, and I don't know if I'm going to remember all of them, but in a way, one of the things that I think the film brings up is, what is art for and who is it for, right? I think, in my personal opinion, is that an artist makes art because they are hoping to connect with someone, with others. That it's like, this is what's inside of me, or this is what I'm struggling with, or this is, whatever. And hopefully I'm not alone in this, and, I can share it with other people. I think so. In a way, like, I think that Kincade, he really loved doing those events. He would have like thousands of people lining up to like buy prints, and he would sign them. And he always had like a kind or cheerful word for every single person. And I mean, can you imagine like being in like a hotel convention room, and, like just signing like 3,000 or whatever prints for people? And
it was like Comic-Con, but for art.
Yeah, exactly. I think that I think it all goes back to that sort of like running away from what he was afraid of. Like, I think he just, he's a probably very sensitive, fragile person on the inside. And, he kind of could not look at and process the stuff that made him feel bad. And, something that Nanette says in the film is like, I don't think he felt worthy. And I think that that's totally, I think it's really astute, because it's like, if you build all of the stuff that you were just saying, like this incredible like success story and beautiful life, and if you don't feel worthy of it, there's kind of like something in you that's going to like push you to topple it all. which is what happened.
Yeah, he was and like the phrase, and I wasn't even thinking about it before, but it just popped in my head as we're talking about what Nanette said about being worthy is, how we say we're our own worst critic, we're our own biggest critic. And the thing is, like, and that is something else you talked about in the film, because like the title of the film, Art for Everyone, Art from Everybody, came from a article that was written in 2021 by Susan Arlene, and it's
2001. 2001.
It was, what did I say? I said 220.
I think you said 2021, but it was in 2000.
2001. Listen, time means nothing. Time is ephemeral. Yes, 2001. Thank you. And like and I thought it was interesting because I read the piece, and she's not critically scathing of him. What she does in that piece is give people a background of who he is, how his business works, how people look at him as this inspiring figure, and like talks about how they had the master highlighters, people would come in and professionally highlight his art and stuff. And he took great umbrage with that. He was like offended, like, how dare you? And like this, and it sparked off this whole interest into him from the art world, the professional art world, where people were like, oh, it's not that either you love him or you hate him, but like people were like, didn't know what to make of him, because he's like, you can see how incredibly talented he was. Because even though people might say, even though the paintings are contrived and it's this fantasy and it's like this make-believe world of perfection and Americana stuff, like the detail that he puts into these paintings is incredible, and like they're fine detailed, and it's just like, and the thing is that he thought he wasn't worthy, but the entire time I was watching this film, I'm like, if you had just shown people the other paintings, he would have realized that he not only was not worthy, but he would have been considered to be probably one of the greatest contemporary artists of his time, because like the paintings that you show in the film, like this was impossible, because I think his daughter said he has like 6,000 of them, and they're all very different.
Yeah,
they're all individual, they're all unique. Whereas the art that is public, the art that he's known for, is not that unique, because he repeats the same themes over and over and over again.
Yeah,
I thought that's such an interesting dichotomy of him in particular as an artist, because we know artists like Van Gogh, on Rembrandt, because like the thing that they did is they put themselves on the canvas. They displayed everything of themselves on the canvas. Like you said, that like artists do work because they want people to know them through their art, and it's like he didn't want people to know him through his art, but it's just
he wanted to curate what
he wants to curate his image. And like you talked about all the people coming up to him and stuff, and like he was presenting a facade, his own story, his own narrative of what he wanted people to be like. And it's just like, and it's such a sad thing to think that he had all of these different facets to himself as an artist, but no one ever got to know it because he didn't show it, and because he thought he wasn't worthy. But the same art critics that he was taking umbrage with, the same art critics that he kind of went into contention with, would have been like, my guy, you are here creating work showing your depression. And like they would have been like, we relate to this because we understand depression, we understand being broken, we understand feeling hurt, we understand having contentious relationships with our parents, we understand not feeling worthy enough, we understand these things, but they couldn't relate to him in that because he didn't show them. And I wanted to ask you, as a filmmaker, because in transitioning from being an editor to being a filmmaker, your work is going to be judged completely different. As an editor, like people would judge you on your work as the editing, because the film itself would have been directed by another person, so like that's their vision. But I wanted to ask you about your own idea of being judged as a filmmaker and how you piece this film. I personally love this film because I love even the final shot of the film of how you kind of like you did like this reverse imaging painting. I love that particular shot. I was like, this is brilliant. But I wanted to ask you, just like from your own perspective as a filmmaker, like being able to put yourself out there now and being judged. Like a lot of filmmakers don't like people like me as a critic. I'm like, what? We all get criticized. When you go to school, the teacher marks your paper with writing, and that hurts, but it's necessary because that's what we get. I don't want to ask you.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm having a very unusual experience because the critical response has been extremely positive. And there's a part of me that doesn't really know what to do with that. I think, like we've had basically uniformly positive reviews. We were New York Times Critics pick, which is like huge for an independent documentary. And I'm really grateful to everyone who has responded to the film. I don't know what to say. I just feel really like humbled and grateful. And I have been like waiting for kind of like the other shoe to drop in a way.
But what do you imagine the other shoe to be?
Well, just like somebody to come along and be like, this is terrible. But it doesn't, at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. But, you never know.
You never know. And art is subjective.
Yeah. But I think the thing that's been really powerful for me is, as an editor, you don't get to go to the film screenings. And I've been to most of the festivals that we played with. I've been doing Q&A events now that we're doing the theatrical release. And people just come up to me afterwards and they start sharing their own experiences. And it's really moving to me to know that the film is like touching people in this way. And I feel, like I said, really humbled and honored that it's resonating with so many people.
One of the reasons I wanted to ask you that question is because that kind of mirrors exactly what Kincade's life was about. He put his art out there, the perceived and contrived art, but it gave him a chance to meet people. And that's how people were like, I connected to your art through this, and it is a very surreal experience, and with my work as a film culture critic and a journalist, I go to film festivals and I speak to filmmakers. And one of the reasons I do what I do is because I am just so fascinated by the human brain and the human psyche and how we are able to use art to express ourselves. And something that I love in this film, and like it turns out that his own daughter, I think she's the youngest one, Windsor, she's an artist. And
yeah, she's actually the second youngest, but she's
the second youngest. Okay, right, because there's four. But like she's an artist, and I thought she said something very interesting in the film where she talks about she saw her dad as a performance artist. He put on this he had all of these personas and all of these sides to him. And I think that's who we are as human beings. There's so many facets of us. Who we are at home isn't necessarily who we are in our workplace. Who we are in our workplace isn't who we are at school, and all of these things. And like as a filmmaker, and as the filmmaker of this film in particular, someone who has all of these different sides to him, you got to bring all of that together to create a cohesive story. And that's a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, we all contain multitudes, and he had a lot of interesting characters inside. But that's kind of, I really wanted to try to be as balanced as possible because, when I was setting out to look into this, it was really clear early on that the people who loved Kincade had, a really specific two-dimensional view of him, of who he was. And his critics and detractors had another completely different two-dimensional view of who he was. And I was like, there's got to be a three-dimensional person in there somewhere. And that's what I was hoping to find. And what I hope that viewers take away from the film is the importance of treating each other with like nuance and compassion, even if we have different beliefs and different backgrounds from each other. Right now our politics and our social media landscape and all of these other factors, I think, are really encouraging us to dehumanize each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to rehumanize each other because, in my opinion, that's the only way we'll be able to move forward as a society.
I agree. Because I made I made a note in my things where I was like, it's impossible to do all of what he did and be what he said he was. And I said that because like he's the business mogul, he's doing all of this. But then when you think about just the sheer amount of art he created, not just the public art that was sold, but just the number of canvases that he painted, that would fracture anyone. Because like just a sheer amount, like he's pouring out all of himself into all of these canvases. And it's just like, that's just, I was just thinking, I had to be emotionally and physically exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about depression before, and I think that, honestly, the demands of the business, even though he sought it out, he was in all of the meetings, and he was like, yes, let's do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. Those demands, I think, again, because I think he was trying to run away from something that he was afraid of. He kept piling things on himself, but I think when you combine that level of stress with his already sort of delicate mental health, I think it's not a good combination.
It's not. But we have to wrap now. But I thank you so much, Miranda, for talking with me. And I gotta say, like, for this film in particular, because it made me think of like how there's so much to artists that we don't know, and like there's so much to people that we don't know, even ourselves. Like, like we all struggle to know ourselves, and all struggle to know the people's in our lives. And I think this film is very much art for everyone. But like for anyone who watches it, I hope it does, as you said, like causes people to reflect on how they present themselves, but also what they expect of others. Like sometimes we do expect too much of people, and then we want them to hide who they really are, and that just creates a fracture within who they are. Like we want the perfection, but we don't want the darkness that comes with creating perfection. We want the light, but we don't want the darkness that comes with the light.
Sorry, even though the darkness is what makes the light so beautiful.
Right? It makes you appreciate it even more, like before a flower blooms, it has to grow as a seed. I'm getting way too philosophical here.
A nice poetic way to wrap up.
Right? But thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
You too.
Bye.